Welcome back, lovely ladies. If you want to become the woman of your dreams, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. And join our Patreon for even more exclusive content. Now, let's dive into today's story.
Greg was 45, with streaks of gray in his otherwise dark hair that hinted at years of corporate experience. He had spent over 2 decades climbing the ranks at a prominent marketing firm in a bustling city. The company prided itself on staying ahead of the curve, boasting a fresh public image and touting progressive ideas. Greg was proud of the organization's commitment to innovation, yet he privately considered some of their new initiatives mere window dressing. That was until one cold morning in the middle of the fiscal year, when he was called into the Human Resources Department to participate in an experiment that would challenge everything he thought he knew. He sat in a well-lit conference room, watching a small group of senior figures gather around the table. His boss, a stern woman named Patricia, tapped her pen against the desk and said, "We're testing a new workplace diversity program, something we hope will shift how our employees interact with each other. It's a pilot program, and you're one of the first participants." The rest of the HR team seemed excited, though a few looked nervous. Greg glanced at the thick folder on the table labeled Workplace Role Exchange Program. He cleared his throat. "I'm all for new ideas," he said, hoping he sounded reassuring. "But what does this role exchange entail?" Patricia slid the folder toward him. "You'll temporarily adopt a new identity at work. The purpose is for participants to learn about perspectives they might have never experienced otherwise. And in your case," she continued, "we are asking you to take on a female persona. You will work under a different name, dress differently, and see how your colleagues treat you in that role. The entire point is to observe any discrepancies in treatment or perception." A wave of surprise washed over him. He leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth twitching with uncertainty. "I'm going to be working here as a woman?" "That's correct," Patricia confirmed. "Think of it as an immersive perspective. We suspect you'll notice different expectations, different interactions, and maybe some unique challenges. The experiment will last a few weeks. You'll log your daily observations, and we'll compare them with how your real position typically operates." Greg nodded, trying not to sound resistant. On one hand, he was curious. On the other, he felt unsettled by the prospect of adopting a new identity in a place he had worked for 20 years. "All right," he said, breaking the silence. "I'll do it." Patricia's lips curled into a small smile. "We appreciate your willingness. HR will help you with the logistics, wardrobe, official documentation for the company's internal systems, and of course, we'll maintain strict confidentiality." In the weeks that followed, Greg prepared for his new role. He secretly met with HR consultants who guided him on clothing selection, hairstyling, and even mannerisms. He found himself in front of a mirror at home, awkwardly trying on tailored outfits that emphasized a feminine silhouette. Standing there, he realized he was stepping into uncharted territory. He was no stranger to challenges in business, but he had never in his life worn a pencil skirt and matching blazer. When he gazed at his reflection, he had to remind himself that this was part of a sanctioned experiment. By the end of his training period, Greg had a new employee badge featuring the name Gina. Though the photo still looked a bit like him, the HR team had done their best to style his hair in a way that complemented his face. Makeup was kept simple. Greg insisted he wanted to look professional, not flashy. When the day finally arrived for him to step into the building as Gina, his heart raced. Walking through the front doors, he was confronted by familiar surroundings that somehow felt entirely foreign. The security guard at the front desk, who usually greeted him with a casual nod, paused for a moment before smiling politely. "Good morning. Can I help you? Greg swallowed. I'm here for work. My name is Gina, he said, forcing a pleasant expression. He fumbled for his new badge and held it up. The guard nodded and waved him through. The small interaction left Greg feeling uneasy, as though he was intruding on his own territory. In the elevator, a couple of colleagues entered. They were from a different department, not people he would ordinarily chat with. He noticed their curious glances. One offered a polite, "Morning," and Greg responded with a slight nod, reminding himself that he was no longer in his usual role. He felt a rising tension in his chest as he realized the office rumor mill would probably soon be abuzz. When he reached the open-floor marketing section, he encountered a few more curious stares. Yet to his surprise, no one asked outright who he was. People seemed uncertain how to approach him. Everyone was polite, but there was a sense of distance. Greg tried to appear calm as he settled at a desk that HR had assigned him in a far corner. Normally, he occupied a spacious office with his name on the door, but this experiment demanded he see life from a different vantage point. It wasn't until lunchtime that he experienced a significant moment of discomfort. Standing in the break room, he reached for a cup of coffee and overheard two coworkers commenting on how they thought a new woman had joined the company. They wondered if she had been hired as an assistant or a project coordinator. Greg felt a wave of awkwardness ripple through him, hearing them discuss his new identity in hushed tones, as though he were invisible. He cleared his throat. "I'm new around here," he said, doing his best to keep his voice from trembling. The coworkers turned around. They were both older employees who had known Greg for years, but clearly they didn't recognize him. "I'm Gina." One coworker extended her hand with a friendly smile. "Hi, Gina. Welcome. We didn't realize you had started already." The other nodded and introduced himself. The exchange was cordial, yet it felt far more forced than the usual banter Greg was used to. Typically, employees asked for his input on strategic decisions or pitched ideas. Now he was being welcomed like a newcomer. He sensed a subtle difference in how they looked at him, as though assessing his capabilities in a way he had never experienced before. That first week, Greg's biggest struggle was adjusting to how people's assumptions about him had changed. He found that tasks he had easily delegated in his normal role weren't given the same level of prompt attention when he requested them as Gina. He noticed how senior staff responded more quickly to a male co-worker's suggestion in group meetings, while Gina's comments often met with polite nods but no further discussion. It was eye-opening to observe from this vantage point. On the third day, he was given a modest project, assisting with a brand redesign. He knew the ins and outs of brand strategy better than anyone on the team, but he had to tread lightly or he would reveal too much of his true identity. So he quietly participated in group brainstorms, offering ideas in a measured tone. Usually, his suggestions would have commanded the room. Instead, others continued their discussion as though he were just another junior employee. He wrote everything down, determined to keep a record of the differences. That same afternoon, he found himself sharing a lunch table with Lisa. She was in her mid-30s, had a soft-spoken demeanor, and had been part of the marketing department for a few years. Greg knew her in passing from his normal management duties, but he had never engaged with her deeply. Lisa had warm brown eyes, a gentle smile, and a quick wit whenever she felt comfortable enough to show it. She was a single mother with a demanding schedule, and Greg had occasionally heard snippets about her balancing childcare with late work deadlines. Lisa spotted him alone and asked if she could join. "I'm Lisa," she said, taking a seat across from him. "Gina," he replied. He realized that because of his new role, she had no idea he was actually Greg, the manager. Part of him felt guilty for concealing that, but he reminded himself it was all in line with the experiment. They made small talk at first. Lisa asked about his transition into the office, which ironically was both new and familiar. Greg did his best not to give himself away, and Lisa seemed genuinely welcoming. Within minutes, the conversation took a more personal turn. She mentioned her daughter's soccer schedule, referencing a game that weekend she had to attend. "It's not easy, but I make it work," Lisa said, smiling. "The company is flexible sometimes, though I've had a few comments from certain people about leaving work early," she sighed. "I can't always attend after-hours team-building events, and I know some might think I'm less committed, but I've got responsibilities at home." Greg realized that he had once been among those who criticized employees leaving early, never fully understanding their situations. Hearing Lisa share her experiences made him pause. "It sounds like you have a lot on your plate," he said softly. She shrugged. "It's part of the deal. I'm just glad we have somewhat flexible policies. Plus, I have to keep pushing for these deadlines. Promotion cycles can be tough." Her tone suggested she was torn between ambition at work and her duties at home. As the lunch wrapped up, Greg found himself genuinely enjoying talking with her. He also felt a pang of remorse, recalling moments in his normal role where he might have brushed aside the concerns of employees with family obligations. Lisa, for her part, seemed grateful for someone who simply listened without judgment. Over the next week, a subtle friendship developed between them. Lisa often invited him to lunch, and Greg, in his persona as Gina, found himself wanting to hear more about her experiences. There was an authenticity in how she spoke about deadlines, childcare, and even frustrations with occasional remarks from coworkers. Greg knew what some people said behind closed doors about employees who needed flexible hours, but hearing Lisa's perspective firsthand put the entire dynamic in a stark light. One day, as they walked back from the company cafeteria, Lisa asked, "Gina, I hope you don't mind me asking, but where were you working before this? You seem to know quite a bit about marketing structure. Every time you offer an idea in the brainstorming sessions, it's super detailed." Greg hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "I've been in the field a long time, mostly consulting," he lied, trying to maintain an easy tone. "But I wanted to see how things work here on a larger scale." He hoped it came off as believable. Lisa smiled. "You should speak up more in meetings. Sometimes you let the others talk over you. I do the same thing. I'm slowly learning to be more assertive." Greg recalled noticing how, in group settings, Lisa often got cut off. She would try to share an idea, only to have someone else dominate the conversation. As a manager, he had never been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment. Now, living as Gina, he recognized it happening to himself too. "Yeah," he admitted, "I guess we should push a little harder to be heard." A few days later, Greg found himself in the break room, grabbing an afternoon coffee, when he spotted a group of employees laughing over jokes that teetered on the edge of rude. One of them noticed Greg and halted abruptly. Greg felt that they were holding back because of his presence. Part of him wanted to confront them, but he opted to remain professional and walked away with a polite nod. He later learned that some of the jokes were directed toward a female colleague's outfit choices. They had been making backhanded remarks and had paused because they saw someone else, a presumed female coworker, listening. He realized that in his role as Gina, he was now privy to a different side of casual office chatter. Later that week, the HR manager pulled him aside for a quick check-in. "How's the experiment going so far, Gina?" The manager gave him a pointed look, waiting for details. Greg struggled to articulate the flood of observations swirling in his head. "I'm noticing small things. People make assumptions about my abilities. I see a difference in how quickly they respond to me versus how quickly they'd respond to, say, a male coworker." He paused, catching a glimpse of his reflection in the window. "And, of course, some casual remarks can be quite telling." The HR manager nodded. Be sure you log these experiences. We want detailed notes on how interactions shift. It will help us build a report on where we can improve company culture. Greg found himself scribbling nightly notes on everything: how co-workers addressed him, how quickly they reacted to his emails, and how managers praised him or ignored him. He had a few instances where a male colleague unknowingly explained a project to him in a patronizing way, even though, as Greg, he had designed that very project strategy months ago. The frustration he felt was new, different from any typical annoyance he had in the past. One afternoon, he overheard Lisa struggling to get coverage for a client meeting. She had to pick up her daughter from school because of an emergency, and she needed a coworker to step in for her. Several colleagues claimed they were too swamped. Greg felt compelled to help, but as Gina, he held no real authority to command their assistance. When he tried to encourage someone to take Lisa's meeting, one colleague looked at him skeptically and said, "Who are you to assign tasks? You're not management." He brushed it off politely, but inside he bristled. He realized how easily he had been able to shift tasks around before without even a second thought from subordinates, purely because of his status as a manager. Now, as Gina, he had to persuade them in a more roundabout way. Eventually, Greg ended up taking the meeting notes for Lisa. He spent an hour in the conference room listening to a client's feedback, ensuring that Lisa wouldn't miss crucial details. When he handed the notes to Lisa, she gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said, her tone soft with relief. "I really appreciate the help." Greg simply nodded, feeling a pang in his chest as he realized how rarely he had personally stepped up in such a direct way to ease someone's workload. After a few weeks, Greg began to pick up subtle signals of how some male co-workers would physically or verbally dominate space in meetings. He watched how women navigated around it, often waiting for the right moment to interject or swallowing frustration when overshadowed. He tried to mirror how Lisa or others responded. Sometimes he tried to speak louder or more directly, only to see some eyes flicker with annoyance, as though thinking, "Why is she talking so much?" It was an intangible pressure he had never felt before. Meanwhile, Lisa's life outside work was reaching a critical point. One Friday, she looked drained when she arrived. Greg approached her desk quietly. "How's everything?" he asked. She sighed. "My daughter's got a fever. My sitter canceled at the last minute. And there's this huge deadline today. I'm being pulled in every direction." Greg leaned in. "Is there anything I can do?" Lisa shook her head. "Not really. I'll push through. I don't have the luxury of dropping everything. If I miss this deadline, it'll look bad." Greg watched her juggle phone calls, spreadsheets, and messages from her daughter's school nurse. He wondered how many times he had overlooked these everyday challenges employees like Lisa faced. In the past, he often emphasized the importance of meeting deadlines, not fully considering the personal crises that might be happening behind the scenes. That afternoon, he found himself in a hallway conversation with Patricia, his boss, who still addressed him by his temporary persona. She was curious about how the experiment was progressing. Greg mentioned Lisa's struggles, feeling a strong urge to highlight the burdens employees with family obligations carried. "I think we need more robust support systems for team members who have these kinds of responsibilities," he said. Patricia nodded, but kept her tone even. "We are mindful of those challenges. Our policies for flexible hours are in place, but we can't control every emergency." Greg pressed gently. "Perhaps we can put in place a better coverage system, so if someone needs to step out for a valid reason, there's an assigned colleague to pick up the slack without causing tension." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "We can consider that for the next policy review. In the meantime, keep logging your observations." Then she walked off, leaving Greg feeling uncertain about whether she truly grasped the severity of the situation. Later that week, Greg and Lisa were assigned to work together on a product launch presentation. The team was short-staffed, so they had to collaborate closely in a small conference room for a few days. Greg, still under the name Gina, found it both invigorating and painful to hide his true identity from someone he was growing to respect. He recognized Lisa's remarkable talent in brainstorming creative angles. She had a knack for understanding the target demographic's emotional triggers and shaping marketing messages around them. Late on the second day of their collaboration, Lisa dropped her pen and sighed. "I'm sorry, Gina. I'm just exhausted. My daughter's school situation took a turn. She needs a specialized tutor, and I'm trying to figure out if I can afford it. Single parenting isn't easy, especially with a job like this." Greg reached over and gently placed a hand on her arm. "I know it must feel overwhelming. You're doing an amazing job, though. Just from working with you for the last few weeks, I can see how good you are at your job." She gave a tired smile. "Thanks. Not everyone sees that. Sometimes I feel like I'm just trying to survive each day. I worry if it's hurting my chances for a promotion. There's always a comment about how I can't stay late, or a remark about me not being as available as others." Greg could only nod. He recalled management discussions about employees' dedication. He remembered times when he questioned Lisa's commitment because she left early for school pickup. The memories hit him differently now. As the presentation deadline approached, Greg and Lisa pored over slides, practicing how they would pitch the concept. On the day of the pitch, the room was filled with senior executives, including Patricia. Greg, dressed in a neat blouse and slacks, stood beside Lisa, who wore a formal outfit that reflected her professionalism. They took turns explaining the new product angle, how the rebranding would appeal to a younger demographic, and the cost-effective marketing strategies they had brainstormed. Patricia and the others nodded in appreciation, though some of the men in the room looked at Lisa with the guarded gaze Greg had become familiar with, a silent scrutiny, wondering if she truly had the authority to speak on these matters. Greg felt his pulse quicken as he stepped in to reinforce Lisa's points. He noticed that when Lisa faltered under the weight of their gazes, they collectively shifted their attention toward Greg, even though he was still Gina. They expected the second speaker to either counter or validate Lisa's opinions. Greg did not waver. He maintained a confident tone, echoing Lisa's brilliance. The synergy they displayed in the presentation drew nods of approval. By the end, they secured a green light to move forward with the project, and Lisa was openly commended for her efforts. Afterward, Lisa turned to Greg in the hallway, happiness evident on her face. "We did it," she said. "I wasn't sure how it would go, but that was amazing. Thank you for backing me up." She paused, her voice shaking with relief. "It feels like, for once, they really saw what I can do." Greg smiled. "They definitely did. You have some serious talent." The next morning, Patricia requested a private conversation with Gina. She gave a short nod as Greg walked into the large office. Her expression was calm, but serious. "I've been reviewing everyone's feedback on your performance so far. Some are impressed by your insights, though they're curious about your background. I've heard you've been championing coverage for single parents. Your notes in the log about biases and communication shifts are thorough." Greg recognized that she was carefully choosing her words. "It's been enlightening," he replied. "I believe the team has strong potential, and some policies could evolve to reflect the diverse needs of our staff." Patricia tapped a folder on her desk. "We're nearing the end of this pilot period. Soon you'll return to your usual role. Then we'll finalize the internal report. Are there any final observations you'd like to highlight?" Greg took a breath. "Yes, I think we need a more inclusive culture. That includes how we handle team assignments, flexible scheduling, and the subtle ways people are either encouraged or dismissed in meetings. I also think management training should address how unspoken assumptions can shape how we treat certain staff members." Patricia nodded. noting everything. "We'll include that. Thank you." Greg left the office, torn between relief that he could soon be himself again and regret that this new perspective would be harder to maintain once he was no longer Gina. His heart felt heavy when he thought about Lisa, who did not realize her new friend was actually a man with managerial authority. He wondered how she would react when she discovered the truth. On the final day of the experiment, Greg cleared out the desk he had been using. He folded the clothes HR had provided into a bag, aware that he was saying goodbye to Gina as a daily persona. There was a swirl of emotion he had never anticipated. Before leaving, he stopped by Lisa's desk. She was typing furiously, but paused when she noticed him. "Hey, you leaving early?" she asked with a slight grin, trying to tease but still sounding tired. Greg nodded carefully. "I have to wrap up some things. I just wanted to say thank you for all your help these past weeks. You've taught me more than you know." Lisa tilted her head, puzzled. "I should be thanking you. You've been a real support. I'm going to miss having you around." Greg swallowed the lump in his throat. "I might still be around, just in a different capacity, but I hope things continue to get better for you here." Lisa smiled uncertainly, not fully understanding. "Thanks, Gina." She reached over to give him a quick hug. Greg felt a tug at his chest, wishing he could be more direct in telling her how much respect he had gained for her. Instead, he gave a small wave and left, not wanting to linger any longer. Returning home that night, Greg peeled off the last remnants of Gina's attire and stared at himself in the bathroom mirror. In the reflection, he saw the lines of his own face, the manager who had once been oblivious to so many dynamics. Yet he couldn't erase the experiences he had gained over the last few weeks. He felt profoundly changed. A few days later, Greg walked into the office in his usual business suit and tie. People greeted him by name. "Morning, Greg." He felt like he had stepped back onto an old stage after a strange intermission. Some employees, who had never acknowledged Gina beyond polite nods, now engaged him with immediate deference. It was jarring. He made a mental note to remember what it felt like to be in Gina's shoes. One of the first tasks on his agenda was to meet with Patricia and the senior HR manager to finalize the diversity experiment report. They spent a morning going through data, analyzing Greg's personal notes, and discussing proposed changes to workplace policies. Greg insisted that they address the coverage system for employees with family obligations, create an anonymous feedback channel for microaggressions, and offer more training sessions to department heads about collaborative communication. Patricia listened carefully, occasionally stopping to question feasibility or budgeting, but overall, she showed a willingness to consider his suggestions. When the meeting ended, Greg spotted Lisa in the hallway. She was rushing with an armful of files, her blouse slightly wrinkled, probably from a busy morning. He wondered what she would say if he approached her now. Taking a breath, he decided to break the ice. "Lisa," he called softly. She stopped and turned, looking somewhat surprised. "Yes, Greg," she replied politely. He realized she had a guarded tone, likely because she viewed him as a high-level manager who might be critical of her. He offered a small smile. "I just wanted to see how you were doing. I heard you landed the new product launch project. That's a big deal." Her eyes flickered with a mix of pride and apprehension. "Yes, I'm leading the team on that now." Greg nodded. "Congratulations. If you need any resources, let me know. I'm here to help." Part of him wanted to say more, to mention Gina, but he knew the official guidelines required confidentiality about his role in the experiment. He just hoped that his actions going forward could speak for themselves. Lisa, in turn, seemed grateful for the support, but still hesitant. "Thank you, Greg. I appreciate that," she said simply, before hustling away to her next meeting. Over the following weeks, Greg used his position to quietly champion a new coverage system for employees who needed flexible schedules. He explained to the board of directors that high turnover could be prevented if the company made small but significant accommodations. He referenced data about how employees, especially those with caregiving roles, could be more productive with supportive structures in place. The board initially resisted, worried about increased costs or logistical nightmares. Greg responded with a pointed reminder that an inclusive environment would benefit the company's reputation and long-term retention. He also proposed a manager training program focusing on the subtleties of group communication. "There are times," he said in a formal presentation, "when some voices get talked over, not because of any deliberate intent, but because of unconscious habits in meeting dynamics." He did not go into personal anecdotes, but he channeled everything he had felt as Gina. Patricia observed all of this with a raised eyebrow. One afternoon, she caught Greg by the coffee machine. "You've become quite the advocate," she said plainly. Greg shrugged, sipping his coffee. "I just think we can do better." She studied him for a moment. "If this yields positive results, it might become a hallmark initiative. You're potentially reshaping how we operate." "I hope it makes a difference," Greg said. A month after returning to his normal role, Greg noticed subtle shifts in the office culture. Managers were encouraged to rotate meeting facilitation, ensuring that no single voice dominated. Employees who needed time off for family matters were invited to speak with HR to find suitable coverage. None of these changes were perfect, but they were steps in a direction that felt more equitable. Greg felt a sense of fulfillment watching new policies roll out, though he also felt a slight ache whenever he spotted Lisa navigating her hectic day. He tried to make it a point to check in with her occasionally, if only to see if the changes were helping. One afternoon, he found Lisa alone in the break room, staring blankly at a vending machine. He approached her gently. "Everything all right?" She gave him a tired smile. "Just a rough day, but I did manage to arrange coverage for tomorrow's meeting so I can pick up my daughter on time. HR said the new coverage rule is in effect, so that's good." Greg's eyes lit up. "I'm really glad to hear that. Let me know if there's anything else you need." "Truly, Lisa, we want to make sure the team can function without draining people to the breaking point." She nodded, her expression shifting from surprise to cautious appreciation. "Thanks, Greg. It helps knowing management is on our side." He paused, considering what else he could say. "You know, you're very skilled at leading projects. Keep that in mind when you apply for the next leadership position. I think you'd do well in a higher role." Lisa's cheeks reddened slightly. "I'd love the chance. I just never felt confident that I'd get a fair shot." Greg offered a reassuring nod, memories of his time as Gina rushing back. "I hope you believe that your work speaks volumes." In the weeks that followed, Greg made sure to highlight Lisa's contributions. When executives asked about the progress on the product launch, he would emphasize her leadership. While some senior members still seemed hesitant, likely due to their own ingrained biases, Greg noticed a shift. Lisa was slowly earning a reputation as a reliable professional. She was receiving credit for her ideas instead of having them passed off or overshadowed. One afternoon, as Greg was finalizing his monthly executive report, Lisa knocked on his office door. She entered with a determined look on her face. "Greg, I'm sorry if this is direct, but can I ask you something?" "Of course," he said, putting down his pen. He motioned for her to take a seat. She sat, clasping her hands. "I heard rumors from some coworkers about a workplace experiment. They mentioned there was a woman here a few weeks back, Gina. They said she seemed well-versed in the same areas you are. Some thought she might have been a consultant. Now she's disappeared, and suddenly you're championing policies that help people like me. Is there any connection?" Greg felt his pulse speed up. The experiment was supposed to remain as confidential as possible, but rumors in an office setting were almost inevitable. "HR asked me not to discuss the details," he said carefully. She studied his face, her brow furrowed. I understand. Gina was supportive and insightful. You're being supportive and insightful. In any case, I'm glad for it. If you had something to do with those changes, thank you. Greg offered a small smile. You're welcome. I want this company to retain talented individuals, people like you. Lisa nodded, exhaling a breath she seemed to have been holding. I appreciate that more than you know. In the end, I just hope all this leads to a better environment for everyone, not just me. It's a work in progress, Greg said softly. Time passed, and Lisa continued to shine. She submitted an internal application to lead a new marketing initiative for an international client. Greg was not on the direct hiring panel, but he expressed his honest endorsement of her capabilities to the relevant decision-makers. By the time the official announcement was made, Lisa was promoted to a higher position. She would be overseeing a segment of the marketing division for the upcoming quarter, a significant step forward in her career. Greg found her in a celebratory mood, though she was still juggling the usual single-parent challenges. She approached him with a smile in the lobby one morning. I got the promotion, she said, almost breathless with excitement. He grinned widely. That's fantastic, Lisa. You earned it. She took a moment, as if searching for the right words. I know we've had our professional boundaries, but your encouragement really made a difference. It's nice to feel recognized by someone in senior management. Greg felt a wave of gratitude. It's nice to see deserving people succeed. Lisa opened her mouth as though she might say something else, then decided against it, simply giving him a thankful nod. A few days later, Greg received an email from HR congratulating him on the success of the pilot program. They attached a summary of his observations and indicated that further expansions of the project might roll out in other departments. The email also mentioned that the data would remain confidential. If Greg wanted to reveal his role to colleagues, it was within his discretion, but the company would not disclose it on his behalf. Greg pondered whether to ever tell Lisa the full truth. He guessed that it might change her perspective on him, but there was no easy way to do it without violating some aspect of the arrangement. In any case, the changes were already happening. Lisa was ascending in her career. Company culture was shifting, even if slowly. Greg realized that might be enough. He felt relieved that the positive outcomes of those few weeks as Gina were now manifesting in practical ways. The friction between certain managers and employees with caregiving duties was gradually lessening. Over the next few months, Greg continued his daily work as a manager, but his interactions were different. When he held team meetings, he made sure to invite quieter members to share their thoughts before louder voices could dominate. He encouraged a no-interruption rule, politely but firmly reminding everyone to let each speaker finish. He also frequently dropped by Lisa's office to see if she needed anything for the new project she was overseeing. She was thriving, albeit tired. Whenever they spoke, he noticed a deeper mutual respect. One late evening, Greg was working on annual performance reviews. The office was nearly empty, just the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Lisa was one of the few people still around, finishing up a pitch document. Greg decided to take a quick break and walked over to check on her. She glanced up with a weary smile. "Burning the midnight oil?" she joked, her voice slightly hoarse from a long day. Greg nodded. "I wanted to make sure these performance reviews are fair and balanced." He paused, leaning on the doorframe. "How's your pitch coming along?" She turned her screen so he could see the outline. "It's going well. I just want to impress the senior leaders. Sometimes I still feel like I have to prove myself." Greg's gaze softened. "I get it, but you've done a remarkable job. If there's any specific resource you need, let me know. I can move some budget around if it helps the final presentation." Lisa's eyes flickered with gratitude. That would be amazing. Thank you, he nodded. Anything for the new star of the marketing department. She laughed, a genuine, joyful sound. I wouldn't go that far. They both fell into a comfortable silence for a moment, letting the hum of the overhead lights fill the gap. Then Lisa turned serious. Greg, I really appreciate how you've changed some things here. The coverage system, the way meetings are run, the willingness to listen when people have different needs. It's made a real difference in my life. Greg felt a stir of emotion. I'm happy to hear that. I've learned a lot this year, in ways I never expected. Lisa seemed to sense something behind his words, but she just nodded gently. We can all grow, she said, and it helps to have people in leadership who actually care. He lingered a moment longer before returning to his office. Once inside, he closed the door quietly and sat down at his desk. Reflecting on the journey, he remembered that first day stepping into the building as Gina, filled with nerves and uncertainty. He thought about how each conversation revealed hidden challenges many colleagues faced daily. He remembered the awkwardness of adopting a new persona, the shock of not being taken seriously, and the quiet gratitude of those who felt seen when he offered help. All of it led him to a renewed perspective on how workplaces can shape lives. For the next few months, he continued advocating for policies that benefited the entire staff. He was careful not to single out any one group, focusing on inclusive language and consistent standards. Whenever a colleague encountered difficulties, Greg tried to approach it with more understanding than he would have before. He noticed that people began to open up to him more freely, trusting that he would not dismiss their concerns. Word traveled around the office that Greg was a manager who actually listened. He brought empathy to his decisions, something that had been missing in his previous approach. It was nearly a year after the experiment when Lisa received a major opportunity, a chance to head an international campaign, traveling abroad to negotiate with clients. She was elated, but also worried about her daughter. However, the new policies allowed for remote work options, and she had built enough trust with colleagues to arrange coverage when she needed to travel. When she came to inform Greg of her acceptance, she glowed with excitement. "Thank you for everything," she said. "I never would have pursued this without your support." Greg smiled broadly. "You made this happen for yourself. I'm just glad to help remove a few obstacles." He watched as she left his office, feeling a sense of pride that was far more fulfilling than any quarterly profit margin. In that moment, Greg reflected that the short weeks he had spent as Gina had transformed his approach to managing people. Although he never openly revealed his experiment to the entire office, the lasting outcome was evident in the changed environment and his refined leadership style. He no longer viewed personnel concerns as trivial disruptions to productivity. Instead, he saw them as vital parts of each person's reality. The empathy he had gained allowed him to make decisions that balanced the company's interests with genuine respect for individuals. On the anniversary of the pilot program, Patricia summoned Greg for a final meeting about it. She invited him into her office and smiled. "I just wanted to let you know that the leadership team has reviewed all data from the experiment. The shifts we've seen in your department are substantial. We're going to roll out a second wave of the program to other divisions, and your name is on the short list to help oversee its implementation." Greg arched an eyebrow. "You're serious?" "Completely," Patricia confirmed. "You provided the blueprint for how to enact real changes. The board wants to replicate that success company-wide. We'll probably train a few more executives to undertake similar role swaps, maybe not exactly the same as yours, but with similar objectives." Greg was silent for a moment, letting the gravity of the news sink in. "That's great," he managed. "I'm glad to hear we're expanding it." Patricia leaned in. "Your personal experience brought about tangible improvements. If you're comfortable, we'd like you to share some of your findings in a talk for the next corporate conference. You don't have to give every detail, but a broad overview." He thought about it, recalling how personal and disorienting those weeks had been, yet he saw the immense potential in spreading this message. "I'll do it," he said at last, "but I'll keep certain specifics to myself." Patricia nodded. "Of course." As Greg left her office, he felt a mixture of excitement and melancholy. The identity of Gina was something he could never fully detach from now. It had opened his eyes to the biases embedded in the workplace and society at large. Even if the role swap had been temporary, the impressions it left were permanent. Later that evening, after most employees had gone home, he wandered to the desk once labeled for Gina. It was now occupied by a new junior staffer. He couldn't help remembering the anxious morning he first arrived, unsure how anyone would treat him. He also recalled Lisa's kindness when she sat with him in the cafeteria, the jokes about them both being overshadowed in meetings, and their late-night sessions for the brand redesign. On his way out, he saw Lisa's door was ajar. She was wrapping up a phone call, presumably finalizing details for her international trip. He knocked softly. She waved him in. "Hey, Greg, you heading out?" she asked as she ended the call. He nodded. "Yeah, just about. You?" She leaned back in her chair, smiling. "I'm actually done for the night. Believe it or not, I have it all under control." She laughed lightly. "Remember when I couldn't even imagine leaving on time?" Greg grinned. "Things have changed." She stood, gathering her bag. "Yes, they have, in more ways than I expected." She hesitated for a moment, as if she might say something else, then shook her head with a smile. "I'll see you tomorrow." As he left, Greg wondered how Lisa would react if she ever learned that Gina was really him. But he found solace in the fact that it no longer mattered. The important changes had already taken place. She was recognized, the policies were in place, and people were starting to feel more supported. That was the real result he had hoped for. In the months that followed, Greg grew into a more thoughtful leader. He watched employees settle into a new normal where collaboration felt more balanced. He noticed fewer quick judgments about colleagues who needed special arrangements and more managers willing to consider flexible solutions. There was still work to be done. Bias did not vanish overnight, but the seeds were planted. When he finally stood in front of a conference room packed with fellow executives to give a talk about fostering a better workplace, Greg felt strangely at peace. Without disclosing everything, he spoke about empathy, about small changes in communication that can have a big impact, and about policies that allow every staff member to bring their best. He saw nods of recognition in the audience, even from those who might have once been skeptics. He ended his talk by stressing the importance of leadership that listens rather than dictates. After his speech, a few executives approached him to ask for more detail. While he kept Gina's identity hidden, he made it clear that his passion for the topic came from direct, immersive observation. Many of them were intrigued by the idea of participating in a similar experiment themselves, though some seemed apprehensive about stepping so far outside their comfort zones. Greg encouraged them gently. "It's not easy, but it's worth it," he said, choosing his words carefully. By the end of that day, Greg realized that the best outcome of the entire journey was not just the company's transformation. It was the realization that, from this point forward, he would never overlook the challenges some employees face just to do the same job as others. He would always remember the perspective he gained. He would remember how Lisa's day-to-day life, once invisible to him, was actually filled with hidden battles. He would keep that knowledge at the forefront of every decision he made as a manager and colleague. In the quiet comfort of his office late one evening, he opened the final draft of the diversity program's findings. The document included a section highlighting the success of the coverage system, the importance of respectful communication in meetings, and the new channels for feedback. Greg typed a quick personal note at the bottom, a small reminder to future participants. Approach everything with an open mind. You'll be surprised by what you learn about your colleagues and about yourself. Then he saved the file and shut off his computer. He took one last look around. The office was dark except for a few floor lamps. He felt a deep sense of relief and gratitude for the experience. Although the role of Gina had ended, the lessons from that time were woven into his life. He stepped out of the office, locked up, and walked down the hallway. A few cleaning staff glanced at him with familiar nods. Greg thought about how each person in the building had their own concerns and story. He wanted to lead in a way that recognized those realities, no matter who they were. As he rode the elevator down to the lobby, he recalled Lisa's laughter, the gentle way she explained her world, and the trust she placed in Gina. He hoped that, in his current role, he was giving her the same genuine support she had shown him. That felt like the truest measure of change, fostering an environment where everyone's voice could be heard and respected. Reaching the lobby, he stepped out onto the street. The city lights sparkled, and the evening air felt crisp. Greg walked quietly to his car, feeling that although this chapter had closed, a new one had begun, one in which he carried a broadened perspective wherever he went. His position as a manager would never be the same again, and neither would his interactions with people like Lisa. That knowledge made each step forward feel purposeful, and he drove home with a sense of conviction that he had never before experienced in all his years of corporate life.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.